this subject remains a bit of a mystery to me still. I have a general conception of why it feels that when something gets burned in ORAS, it is toast. It is KO'd immediately. But I can't 100% put my finger on it. So I'm still working through it. I will give you, my idea where I'm coming from. But this is not just an idea I have, because I never used to really think about ORAS Burn as particularly broken. And to explain to you where this whole thing comes from, we have to dive back into the lore. So, this replay on the screen right now is from June 2016, and at this time, ABR's stall team was dominating everything. And this player, Vince2612, he came up with a Suicune set. Sub, Protect, Calm Mind, and Scald. And it is now known as Vincune, named after him, because he was so clearly 100% his invention. It wasn't like, a bunch of players came together and realized. It's like, no, he invented this style of setup. Now whenever you have Sub, Boosting Move, Protect, and then, stab move, then that is called like a Vink Pokemon. Like if you were to use Sub, Protect, Calm Mind, Lava Plume, Entei, then that would be Vinte. Pokemon naming conventions are strange. Anyway, so he came up with this Stallbreaker Suicune set as a response to the ABR stall team. And suddenly, Suicune usage was already, very respectable. But it was mostly, rest sets. It was going to be Rest Roar or Rest Sleep Talk, whatever. But now, it was all about Sub, Protect, Calm Mind, Scald. And this set took off, and people absolutely hated it. Because it could just take over games so ridiculously quickly. Now, this is about Burn in ORAS, not just Suicune, right? And the reason I'm singling out Suicune here, even though in this battle it doesn't really wind up doing much because it gets crit by Mega Latias there, whereas otherwise it probably, very likely would have done some very obnoxious things. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that for the other forms of Burn in ORAS, and yes, there are many other different forms of Burn in ORAS, like Talonflame, for example, they never felt very overwhelming to me. But the one exception was when I saw Suicune in action, and then when I used it myself, it was like, wow. And I know it's using Protect, but other forms of Burn distributors use Protect and Sub and things like that, and just generally like playing a longer game. Even when Keldeo is trying to burn something, the most offensive Scald user there is, that it's still not going to just stay in and spam it over and over. You burn the Amoonguss, and then you switch out and wear Amoonguss down over time. And so the Amoonguss user still feels like it has more time for its user to adapt their game plan to the reality of this burn. Whereas with Suicune, it always felt like as soon as something gets burned, it is like gone immediately. And yes, part of this is because Sub Protect Suicune is so difficult to deal with that it winds up that you're walking on a tightrope against it. And, as soon as one little thing goes wrong, it'll take that ball and run a mile with it, right? But it wasn't just Suicune what I noticed after a while, because for the last couple months of ORAS, people were complaining about Suicune, calling it broken, and then, into Sun and Moon, people were like, oh, well, Burn is nerfed, but who cares? We're going to spam Suicune anyway. And you had all these lovely, wonderful games where Suicune would stall out of Toxapex with pressure. But the burn was obviously not as much of an issue when it doesn't even when it just cancels out leftovers and doesn't out damage leftovers. So when Suicune burned something, then it felt like it was toast immediately. Like if it burns a Latios or a Keldeo, then you're just out of luck. And then you start noticing similar things, like if Keldeo burns a Latios, then it's similarly bad. Or, if Rotom Wash winds up burning something and then Volt Switching, then it can get out of hand very quickly, even against things with Regenerator, like Tangrowth or Amoonguss. And even though Amoonguss runs Black Sludge way more than Tangrowth runs Leftovers, then it will still start getting worn down uncomfortably quickly. So, it's and obviously there are very many methods of burn prevention. We're not really talking about that, because obviously having a good ORAS team involves using things like Clefable, Poison Heal, Gliscor, Heatran, Megazard Y, also, and other Pokemon that can deal with burn fairly decently. Not just being completely immune to it. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about more, why does it feel in ORAS that everything gets KO'd so much more quickly than in other generations by burn? And I'm talking strictly about generations 3 through 5 here, which also have 12.5% burn and have reliable methods of distributing burns, because in GSC, then yes, burn is 12.5, but you cannot reliably get burns with Flamethrower or Fire Blast, and there's no Will-O-Wisp. And even if you're playing Ubers and you run Ho-Oh, then there's Sacred Fire, yes, but it only has 8 PP, and Rest is everywhere. So the reason I'm investigating this is because I found it so interesting how this is not really, this is not objective by any sense of the imagination. It was just, why was so much of the player base feeling that ORAS Burn was so much more impactful? And I'll give you more specific examples. So last few months of ORAS, people start calling Suicune broken. They started calling people who used sub-protect Suicune, using a cheap strategy, all that stuff. That doesn't happen, right? But it continued. And around the time of the Smogon Premier League, that was being prepared for end of 2016 to begin early 2017, then there were some players who were very vocal about it, and this one team had like this joke like sign-up sheet, like, show that you are qualified by answering these questions, right? And it was mostly a joke, but like one of the questions was, what is the most broken Pokemon in ORAS OU? And the answer they were looking for was Suicune, because they they thought it was so unbearable. And then in early 2017, Suicune was just taking over game after game after game. And one of the replays that I've selected for this video is a prime example of people going out of their way to try and beat Suicune and still losing to it. And a huge part of that is Scald. Or okay, I mean, I'm not trying to turn this video into an anti-Scald rant, believe it or not, but it's Burn. And like the Suicune is broken thing, that kind of died down, right? Like eventually, people would figure ways out around it. Like they would run Rotom Wash variants with enough special attack to break Suicune substitute with Volt Switch after a Calm Mind. So things of that nature. But it was like, why has this never been brought up before? And it's not like it's a discovery in a new generation, then you go back and apply it to those earlier generations either. It's not like people were going back to gens 3 through 5 and saying, oh my god, everything dies so quickly to burn now. Now, I'm not saying things don't get KO'd, relatively quickly by burn in those generations, but that didn't happen at all. Even when these, ORAS Sun and Moon players were playing those gens, they were involved in those gens. And yes, burn is a big factor in those gens, but why did that feeling not transfer? And that is what I was interested in. Especially after Sun and Moon came out, then people were, relieved that burn wasn't inflicting so much. And the expression started getting thrown around. Whenever there was an ORAS game that was played after Sun and Moon, people would throw around the phrase Broken ORAS Burn, or that Pokemon just got O-code by burn. You would have an 80% Latios, perfectly in perfectly good condition to do whatever, but you would say, oh, well, it's burned, so it's O-code. It's basically dead. So completely seriously. And like, yes, there's a little bit of an exaggeration to it, but the fact is, when it's burned in ORAS, it's so much more difficult to leverage use out of. And I'm not saying that burned Pokemon aren't severely hindered in gens 3 through 5, but I was wondering, like, what is going on here that specifically makes it feel so much worse in ORAS? So these are my vague ideas, and I very much invite you to agree, disagree, give your own reasoning. Even if you agree, you think, oh, well, I think that's probably what it is, but I think it's for different reasons. So what makes this particularly fascinating to me is that in gens 3 through 5, there is permanent sand everywhere. But you'll see something like, in Gen 3, for example, you'll see, and this is not sand-affected Pokemon, but sometimes Swampert will take a burn because you don't have anything better to deal with Gengar, right? And, okay, you don't want your Swampert burned, but it will still put a handsome amount of work in, or you'll see a burned T-Tar, like a Pursuit Tar, do this all the time. Or even like a burned Salamence spamming special moves, or a burned Zapdos, So, and these are not Pokemon you ideally want burned. You should not be building your team with Zapdos Burn Absorber, but it's more the... Yeah, when there's permanent sand flying around, then it feels like it should be more overwhelming to deal with burn, and yet the same feeling did not transfer. And obviously, you have to have some semblance of comparison for the Pokemon that are being burned. Like Tornadus Therian being burned is not the same as Swampert being burned, for example. But that's another thing. Even Tornadus Therian, and yes, Rock's weakness and all, but Tornadus Therian and Amoonguss, or even Slowbro, for example, Slowbro has Regenerator and Slack Off. And it still feels like it gets worn down incredibly quickly with burn. And so one of the factors I'm thinking might contribute to this is, in the case of Slowbro, not much else switches into Keldeo, so you're kind of forced to deal with it more. And there's more Scald in ORAS because there's less incentive to use Surf. Like in Gen 5, you will use Surf on your Scarf Keldeo or your Specs Keldeo because it's 95 base power, not 90. And when you get to Gen 6, you think, oh, well, if it's only 90, then I may as well just, go for Scald instead. But, yeah, so I think that might be part of it. But there's also a little more burn in ORAS, and I put together a list. Okay, so in Black and White, your list of burn distributors, like, I'm going to list, not all of them are the same level of common, but anyway, Heatran, Rotom Wash, Politoed, Tentacruel, Keldeo, Slowbro, Slowking, Gastrodon, Jellicent, Ninetales, Mew, Seismitoad. Now in ORAS, you've got Heatran, Rotom Wash, Keldeo, Volcanion, Slowbro, and Mega Slowbro, but we'll just call it Slowbro, Slowking, Gastrodon, Jellicent, Alomomola, Suicune, because Alomomola is not really used in Black and White. Alomomola, Suicune, Talonflame, Mew, Starmie, Quagsire, and Seismitoad. And Cofagrigus. I don't know how you say that name. Anyway, so there are a lot of burn distributors, and obviously the metagame has evolved in a way that makes the complaints of late 16, early 17 seem kind of antiquated. It's like, oh, well, not much is getting O-coded by burn anymore because we've got all these water-absorbed Pokemon. I mean, Seismitoad gets used a fair chunk. I was looking through the replays of this SPL, and I didn't quantify this, but I felt like Volcanion was the most common water type I saw. And Volcanion is an amazing Pokemon, so I'm very happy to see it. But, yeah, it felt like the most common anyway. I'm sure it's, actually look up the actual usage statistics before you believe me on that. But the point being that, now you've got a water type that is also, or a burn distributor that is itself immune to both forms of burn. Because, a water-absorbed Pokemon will be immune to Scald burns, but it will not be immune to Lava Plume and Will-O-Wisp burns. And with Volcanion, it being a fire type, you obviously have the immunity to Will-O-Wisp and Lava Plume burns, as well as, Flamethrower or whatever. And, of course, Scald. So, makes it very unique in this regard. And also, it's very difficult to not get burned by Volcanion because you can't absorb it with, like you might absorb an Alomomola's weak Scald with what's it called? Gliscor. You might not be able to do that. But, and you can't do it with Clefable either. It's too strong, and it even packs Sludge Bomb sometimes. And nothing else really wants to absorb it either, so... Yeah, Volcanion is very good in that regard. So the metagame has evolved to be better guarded against burns, but also this is the game I was talking about for those watching the screen. That Amoonguss is using Seed Bomb to break the Suicune substitutes and try and clear Smogum, and it also has Rest, so that it can stall out, getting Scald burned. And will that be enough? Wait and see. Anyway, so... yeah, the teams are better guarded against burn now. But when a Pokemon does get burned, and I'm not just talking about physical attackers where they're weak and they're not going to do any damage even if they do stick around. No, I'm talking Pokemon that use utility moves or special moves or whatever, and it feels like they're just completely gone. And I mean, this might, that's why this is still partially such a mystery to me, because this might just be like a collective hallucination. It's like, is it really worse than Gens 3 through 5? And the overarching theory I had while discussing this with my buddy was maybe the fact that there's no permanent sand makes it feel worse because the burn distributors themselves are or now have greater longevity. For example, Rotom Wash burns something in Gen 5, and okay, there's permanent sandstorm, and obviously, the games with rain, this is something else, right? Where Tentacruel in rain is just the most nightmarish thing ever, but that's specific. And we're talking general terms, in that's specific to Tentacruel, I should say. Whereas, to Tentacruel being a problem in and of itself. And part of that is Tentacruel's unkillability. But we're talking like the Pokemon more comparable across the two generations, like Rotom Wash. Or even a Scalding Keldeo with leftovers. Both of those might burn something, but they're not going to really... they're not going to be healing with lefties. And that means that, okay, I might get burned, but but the other Pokemon does not have such incredible longevity that they're going to outlast me. And take another example. If your Swampert gets burned, but you damage Gengar in the process, okay, the Gengar, it burned my Swampert, that's not great, but I damaged the Gengar, it is not healing with leftovers. So it's much different than the Suicune, which is healing with lefties and doing sub-protect Suicune things. That's just an idea, though. Again, I'm not 100% on it, but I just find it so fascinating how Burn wasn't really complained about. And I mean, even it's most comparable, I guess, to Heatran, because Heatran obviously has been a big burn distributor for generations, and it did so in the permanent sand generations while it was immune to burn itself. So Heatran obviously is very, very famous for dropping down to low health and then getting back up to what seems like full just through protect spamming. And that obviously, it's very similar to the way Suicune does Suicune things, and that it wears you down. And suddenly, if Heatran is the most direct point of comparison between the generations, in that what happened on a large scale in Gen 6, where water types were burning everything, and not that wasn't happening in Gen 5, but water types were burning everything in Gen 6 and sticking around with their longevity because there was no more permanent sand to deal with, as opposed to Gen 5. And that was what Heatran had been doing in permanent sand already. So I guess the idea is that what Heatran had been doing with sticking around and it feeling like Heatran is so tough to KO with Protect and sub. I mean, Heatran even used Sub Protect sets. Heatran's so tough to KO, and you have such a razor-thin margin of error against it, such a short window in which you can actually deal with it, that that burn lands, and suddenly your already tenuous plan is just completely shot. And then when Suicune and all these water types like Alomomola come along and do that kind of thing, then it feels even more... It feels similar to the Heatran effect, but on a mass scale, because at least when Heatran's doing that, it's just one Pokemon. And now with these waters, it's something else. Now, again, this is just a theory. I am not... this is not scientifically, empirically researched or anything. But, yeah, that's the basic idea. So I just wanted to make sure that was everything. I think that was basically the whole idea, but again, I'm really not sure, because it just seemed... I mean, part of it, me also wants to say, I never felt like it was a problem before. I don't really know that I still think it's a problem now. And I also know that the group of players that made Broken ORAS Burn a popular phrase were also well known for calling everything they didn't like broken, and really meaning it. You know, like I remember some of these players would say like DPP Bronzong was broken. It was always like protect toxic Pokemon, like Bronzong and DPP or Skarmory in Advance. So I don't know. I think that kind of speaks for itself. But then it was, even players who weren't part of this, like, I hate DPP Bronzong clique, that were joining and saying, oh man, Sun and Moon is so much better than Oris because you don't get O-code by burn. And I was like, how did this become such a widespread sentiment? It's... I don't know. That's why I am putting it out there and asking. But I'm just making sure that I didn't... Because I'm scrolling through the convo I had with my buddy to see, because it's, maybe it's harder to avoid in Oris. I don't even know if that's true because Clefable is so good, but yeah, that's kind of what we're wondering. I think that's basically everything. So another thing is, I wrote, just to reiterate the black and white thing with a little more detail, like your traditional bulky waters like Suicune and Alomomola, or like a Milotic, for example, they don't really exist in black and white because they're not good on rain or sand, and the lack of permanent weather really opens them up in Gen 6. So that makes every turn and dealing with them, or that makes dealing with them in terms of their longevity, it's not the same thing. And when they are not being buffeted by the sand, then you really get the full brunt of their tanking ability and their longevity, and that's, it's tough. So I don't know. It's because it's still, I do still notice it sometimes, and I'll give you an example of a racing game. I did the video on CBB versus Nico, I think, and he leads off with the Scarf Volcanion, gets a Steam Eruption burn, and it felt like the Manaphy was just, and I know this is part of why Volcanion is so great, because it's really strong, and so that makes the burn more immediately impactful, similarly to how Specs Keldeo was ruining people's lives for years. But it's also the fact that just the burn itself, like you get the burn on the switch, right? That's 12.5. You switch out 25. So in 2 turns, you have just stripped off a quarter of their health. And that just, when you put the math like that, then it's just mind-boggling. So, yeah, I'm now we will just finish by watching these replays. This Tangrowth was avoiding a burn very stubbornly. By watching this replay, and then I have one more that I gathered. Well, I thought I would go on for a lot longer. But yeah, the mystery of Broken ORAS Burn. I don't know. It's, I mean, you also see things like Gliscor the Scald Absorber when it's focused on the defensive ones more. But then, obviously, Gliscor is not coming anywhere near like a Keldeo or a Manaphy or a Volcanion. So, yeah, this game is from the finals of Smogon Tour, and yeah, it's got a Posho using a very interesting team, and Krang using Swords Dance Gliscor Pass to Mega Metagross, and coming up against a Whirlwind Hippowdon, just very stubbornly. Yeah, there's also I don't know, because obviously in Sun and Moon you still don't like being burned, but it's just the feeling of being burned is so much less of a burden when, number one, it doesn't cancel out or it just cancels out leftovers, doesn't outdo it. But number two, like even when you don't have leftovers, for example, you can protect on a Pokemon that's been burned in Gen 7, and it's still going to be a threat for quite a long time. Whereas, you get the burn in Gen 6, and it's like, oh, well, it's basically already gone. And I really am wondering why this isn't in Gen 5 as much. And in Gen 5, and like to an extent with Gen 4, with Clefable and Heatran and like rest Pokemon being more common, I don't know if those metagames are just more naturally built to withstand burn because of how they naturally need to be good against passive damage in general, like the Magic Guard thing, Magic Guard, Gliscor, everything in Gen 5. I don't know. And I guess there being more burn distributors in Gen 6 also has something to do with it. But yeah. All right, Mounts. He was a great player. I remember why I picked this replay. Yeah, we're going to go through it fairly quickly. He's going to spin. Here's a Suicune doing amazing things. And he roars out the Gliscor, taking 2+2 Earthquakes like a beast. Like a beast. What an old expression. So, U-turn. In comes Metagross, gets the Mega. HP fires the Scizor. That's hilarious. And he tries to scare it out. Mash, T-Punch, Meteor Mash. That's a second HP Fire Mega Metagross in this video. My goodness. Yeah, people kind of forgot how broken that thing is. Same with Keldeo. And so he's just mashing it and mashing it and mashing it, and he gets the attack boost. And now in comes another Burn Distributor, Talonflame, countered by a Burn Absorber and Distributor. Well, I guess so is Talonflame. And here's the taunt and Psyshock on the Torn T. Scarfed to a KO with the roll with the poison. Imagine if that was Burn, it wouldn't have even been a contest. So here's Scizor sacrificing itself to Burn. Taunt on U-turn, no? Yeah. Not wanting the roost. Rocks. Talonflame comes in to counter the Superior. It is not HP Rock. It gets knocked off. Fine. So here comes Suicune on the Scarf Defog. And yes, this is it. So... Oh, sorry, I misread it. For some reason, I remembered this in my mind as the Superior being KO'd by a Scald Burn, or a Scald Burn percentages, whereas Gen 7 wouldn't. Whoops. Because I remember I looked at the log and I was like, oh, it took 10% of its health. Oh, Burn was taking the last 10% of its health. And it's like, no, never mind. Anyway, either way, there's, I guess you can lump this into my anti-Scald sentiments. Because I guess in Gen 3 and 4 there's no Scalds, and then in Gen 5 a lot of what constitutes a good team in Gen 5 is dealing with Rain Scald, which is such a monstrous beast. I mean, not only permanent sand, but Scald is rain boosted, and I guess it might be more built into the fabric of the tier. Not to say that you can't deal not to say that you don't have to deal with Scald in order to make a good ORAS team, but I don't know. It's strange. It might not be as integral part of the tier because you're dealing with so many other things. So, yeah, here's Clefable against a knocked off Heatran. So, it's gonna... What's it gonna do? Oh, it does have Ice Beam. He's just holding it back nicely. And Suicune finishes it off fittingly. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please let me know your thoughts on this phenomenon and this mass hallucination of sorts, and I will see you in the next one.